Welcome to Market Shapers, a podcast about harnessing capitalism for good. I'm Inder Singh. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working with incredible people, building products, forging deals, and shaping markets that have impacted millions of lives. On this show, I sit down with the leaders, innovators, and behind-the-scenes deal makers who've changed the way markets work, often in ways most people never see. We'll unpack how they did it, what they learned, and how those lessons can help tackle the big challenges ahead. I'm really excited to have Alan Staple join me today. Alan and I have worked together closely. Alan is the former vice president of market access at the Clinton Health Access Initiative, where he led many of CHAI's most ambitious market shaping efforts over the past decade. He's helped reshape markets for HIV, hepatitis C, contraceptives, diagnostics, and more, negotiating hundreds of access and pricing deals that have touched millions of lives. Alan, welcome. It's great to have you.
Good to see you again, Inder, after it's been a while.
It's been a while. It's really wonderful to reconnect. Alan, you've driven some big impact deals, and you've used market forces and the techniques around the way that businesses work to achieve that impact. Can we talk about one or two of the deals? Let's pick one to start.
Yeah, sure. Let's go back to kind of one of the very, very early deals back in 2010, 11, 12, a deal that we did with Cepheid on their test for TB. Two messages, though, before we start on the Cepheid story. One is about credibility. If you are going to engage in bringing the supply side and the demand side together as a kind of trusted intermediary, the key to that is credibility. How are you going to have credibility with the sellers, the drug companies and diagnostic companies? How are you going to have credibility with the buyers who may represent national health services, in our case, or international agencies that are procuring products for these countries? How do you get that credibility, and then how do you utilize it to become a trusted intermediary? Let's just keep that in mind about credibility. So a lot of these assignments, especially when I first started, kind of had the mission impossible, sort of sound about them. Somebody would call you up and say, look, we got to get this done. Here's what has to happen. Get on with it. And, call me. And sometimes our goals were extremely audacious and very, very challenging. And you would get about as much background information as they do on the Mission Impossible show. You get two sentences, and then the tape kind of evaporates, and you're going, oh, really? Okay, how are we going to do it? And that was sort of the thing with the Cepheid story. Back then, Cepheid was a pretty well-known molecular diagnostics company. It had gone past the startup phase. It had IPO'd. It had about a $2.5 billion market cap based out in Sunnyvale. It had a very innovative, clever molecular testing system. So gold standard technology, but you didn't need a lab. You could run these things in small facilities. And so they were appropriate for the developing world. And the company was, going gangbusters. I think it had probably about $300 or $400 million in sales. Through some grants that had been provided by the Gates Foundation and others, they had been induced to work over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years to develop a test for TB. Obviously, TB, not a big-time commercial market in the US or Europe. And so funding was provided, some 70 plus million, where universities and Cepheid collaborated. And we came on the scene right after the product had been approved by the WHO, the World Health Organization. And the government of South Africa had announced a massive rollout program, and that was going to be kind of the place where this product would have the most impact. I mean, South Africa had was sort of the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic at that time. And many patients who have compromised immune systems due to HIV are exposed to TB. And actually, TB becomes the cause of death for many AIDS patients. And so critically important product just coming on the market, a lot of excitement, a lot of PR. But what I had been told, before the tape burnt up was that, bad news. The Minister of Health in South Africa has decided that the rollout is way too expensive and the cost of the product has to come down dramatically. And CHAI has committed to negotiate that change. In terms of credibility, I got off to a really rough start. I finally get my visit out at Cepheid, and we'd done some, corporate meet and greets that hadn't gone all that well, but they had at least said they'd hear us out. So I fly my 3,000 miles and get my rental car, and you find Cepheid on one of these, tech parks and very nondescript buildings, and it's a low-cost, hard driving kind of place. So you get into the reception. So here I am, 11 o'clock meeting with the VP of Business Development. And I'm sitting, and I'm trying to be polite. It's 11:30, it's 11:45. So I asked the secretary again, hey, what's going on here? I've been kind of waiting for a while. She kind of, who are you anyway? But calls around and she says, oh, geez, Mr. Staple, I'm so sorry. We're not going to be able to meet with you today. Can I get you a taxi to the airport? What do you mean? That's not going to fly. I can't turn around and go home 3,000 miles without even having the meeting. So I'm kind of scrolling through my phone trying to get the contact number directly because the receptionist is not going to connect me. Finally get him on the phone. He goes, geez, Alan, I'm really sorry, but we realized that you wanted to talk to us about the sale of this product in South Africa. And most of that would be confidential. And I'm afraid we can't talk with you about our commercial relationships with the Ministry of Health and the government in South Africa. But we'll get one of our car services to take you back to the airport. I'm sorry. Oh my God. I tell him, look, we're here at the behest of the Ministry of Health and the government of South Africa. And he goes, well, sure, yeah, but I'd have to see that in writing. And I really, let's set this up for another time and, goodbye. And so I'm going back to the hotel trying to collect myself. I was pretty shook. And I said, well, wait a minute. We're going to have to somehow get a letter on the Ministry of Health stationery with the seal of approval. And that's, how's that going to happen in 24 hours? They're 10 hours ahead of us and so on. Anyway, cut a long story short, CHI was an organization that really did run 24/7, and you responded to emails and you helped your colleagues and you worked as a team. And I put that to the test. So I contacted folks in the South African office I'd never met before, told them what I needed, and realizing, what an extreme request to put something in writing that CHI is going to negotiate on behalf of the Ministry of Health. I said, yeah, and I need it right now. I've got to have it by the time I show up there in the morning. Here's their fax number, send it to my hotel, send it to them. Well, sure enough, I go back to Cepheid at 9:30 in the morning, and they've gotten the fax, a beautifully written letter from the Minister of Health, stamped, signed, sealed, delivered. And everything's changed now. The donuts, the pastries are out, the coffee's there, my name's on the video screen. Mr. Staple, we're so pleased to see you. And so I think credibility on the buy side, who are you really representing? Are you really speaking with authority? Are you representing where the money really is? That was a lesson on, you got to get your act together before you engage with the private sector. You can't just do it as an advocacy thing. You've got to be representing the market side of it, the buy side. The second thing that came up that has to do with credibility, and I think it's about sort of doing your homework on what's really going on and not just taking everything at face value. So we go into the conference room, and I'm just on my own, and they've got about 8 people in there. We're having our coffee and donuts, and everybody's being really nice. And I'm going, gee, that's kind of unusual because, CHI has this reputation of being kind of hard bargainers or wanting to cut the price. They know I'm there over a pricing issue. And I was a little surprised that they weren't more like, okay, why are we even talking to you kind of thing. And then after doing the introductions and explaining to me how the product works, the regulatory, all that nice stuff, the VP of commercial says, Alan, I was kind of surprised they called me into this meeting because, we know a lot. We've been working with South Africa for years. We've done all the trials there, and we already have a contract with them, and the pricing has been decided years ago. So, here's another blow to my story and my credibility. And so I'm keeping a straight face and going, okay, don't panic here. They've already got a signed contract. The price has been agreed. I've been sent on a fool's errand here. I said, okay. Well, great. Can I have a copy of it? I'm sorry, I don't have that with me. Let me just take a look at it. And maybe all of this, we can just, straighten it out. There's not an issue here. And so they passed me around the document that I look at. And I go, okay, I actually have seen this before. But this is a contract between the Gates Foundation and Cepheid and several universities that had to do with developing this product. And it has these access provisions in the back that has this cost plus pricing formula that covers all of these countries. Yep. And South Africa is one of them. Case closed. Told you we had this under control kind of thing. I go, geez, but I don't really think I can go back to the Ministry of Health on a potentially $50 million purchase order here and say it's governed by a contract that they've never seen and they've never signed. I just don't think that's going to fly. And so slowly it sunk in to the commercial team at Cepheid that the contract they had that they had been planning on had not actually been signed by the likely actual buyers. It had been signed by funders and it had been signed by Cepheid. And so when that kind of sunk in for a minute and they realized that, the CEO who they had told, hey, no problem, we've got this thing under control, was probably going to lose his shit over this, that maybe CHI could bring some value and explain to them this arcane world of how does the money flow in global public health? Who are the real buyers? Who really has control? And so right away, the whole attitude changed and they started saying, well, wait a minute, can you stay over an extra day here? Because we need to get this squared away before we have to talk to John Bishop, our CEO again, at the end of the week, because he wanted to know what the heck's going on with all of this. So the contract, the piece of paper they had was worthless. And they knew, and we all knew as business guys, that a party who's not signed this agreement, not looked at it, is not going to be held by it, and is not going to look at that as a negotiating tool. So again, I think credibility then as helping Cepheid understand and being an intermediary, you can get them the order that they don't have, that they desperately want to get. Now we're in a situation where we can talk about price. So there was a lot of thinking on the fly there and kind of sticking to your guns and using your own personal knowledge and business experience to try to establish that credibility. And I think that is one of the key lessons is you as the individual in the way that we've thought about market shaping or access programs. It's not a formula. It's about people. It's about your skills in understanding what's possible in the situation.
I think it also highlights two things, which is, one, you've got to have access to the decision makers if you're going to be a truly effective, trusted intermediary or a market shaping entity. And two, you've got to be a good negotiator too. Without at least those two skills, it's not possible to sort of really make the great progress that you need.
Right. And we maintain that credibility because from that initial meeting, then both sides got into something that's critical in all of these deals, which is analyzing the cost of the product under different volume assumptions. What does it cost if you make $1 million? What about 10 million? What about 20 million? And Chai has certainly used cost plus kind of negotiating tactics as part of how we would set up some of the volume guarantees and deals that we did. And that was definitely on the table with Cepheid. It was a complicated product. There was automation involved in manufacturing, lots of moving parts. But we had a team that on it had, PhD level scientists who understood the technology and understood the component costs. And we also had a person that supported me, Hamish Srinivasan, whose last job had been as a biotech analyst at Goldman Sachs. So when we're sitting around the table with the executive decision-making team at Cepheid, we had people that they could respect. They knew we knew what we were talking about, and they weren't having to kind of educate us on the basics of how do companies assign costs and so on. And in this particular case, and a lot of this is out in the public domain, we went through a kind of cooperative effort under confidentiality, look in detail at the costs of products to try to project what would happen going forward. And basically the problem for both sides was, well, gee, when you first start out, you have a lot of indirect and overhead costs that have to be recovered over low volumes. If the cost of making the product was $8 or something, the allocated overheads might be another $8 when the volumes are very, very low. And then we certainly had some debates about how do you model the future. And again, having an understanding of where the market might go was crucial there. But I think on this particular deal, the COGS side of it, the analyzing costs and coming up with something that both sides would agree were fact-based, and then we can argue about the stuff that's a little more speculative, was crucial. And having enough scientific and business knowledge to be able to do those detailed analysis. What happened in the end, and it was everybody walked away happy, and I think over the long run, the public health sector was very happy, let's say. Cepheid received payments of around $10 or $11 million to compensate them for under-recovered overheads in cutting the price from about $17 a test to just under $10. So they knocked $7 off roughly per unit. Therefore, obviously didn't have that $7 in all the units that were sold over the next 10 years. And as volumes obviously built up, the amount they need to recover on each unit went down. But from the point of view of the public health community, that $10 or $11 million payment, 60 million tests or more were sold under this deal. And so, 60 million times $7 is $420 million. So the payback on the $10 million buy down was immense. And it obviously, opened our eyes to what was possible in terms of how do you accelerate sales of a product in a very, very price-sensitive market. The key here, particularly in low and middle income countries, is every penny counts. And you may get zero sales, which is what would have happened at $17, but you end up selling, 5, 6, 10 million units a year at just below $10. And that's where the buying side decided that they could do it. So I think the take home for us was credibility. You got to have your act together. You got to have your team together, expertise in COGS analysis, both the technical piece of it and then the business side of what happens as volumes increase. And, you've got to go into that nitty gritty or what are these indirects that you're allocating? What's a fair formula for that? And then being able to justify the work that's been done to those that are financing the deal and the Ministry of Health in South Africa, that was the first large purchaser. So that's the Cepheid story. It was certainly exciting for me. You don't know if you're going to have a happy ending on these things until you do. Stuff can always fall apart. You're kind of on the edge of your seat, let's put it that way, for a year or two while you're working on this stuff.
Was there ever a situation in which you thought Cepheid was going to balk at continued engagement in this market? Yeah, I can imagine the CEO, John Bishop, hearing, "What do you mean we don't have a proper price set?" Would be a concern, especially for a large company who's admittedly, in this case, given dollars to develop the product. So they're not investing their own dollars per se. But was there ever a concern from their side?
There was, and we are at times very tough negotiators. There was a famous blow up between our CEO and their CEO about this subject of, you're not going to come in here and tell us what profit margin we're going to make. The other side, some of the Cepheid people had to, tell their own CEO, well, actually, the whole concept here that we signed up for when we developed this product with donor money was a cost plus approach. The plus we can argue about, but we're not challenging the basis of the American free enterprise system. Back in those days, coming from the Clinton Foundation, had its pluses and minuses. If you were dealing with a more conservative company, they didn't want to hear about, public health and so on. So we did have some blowups. It made a big difference in the details. In South Africa, was the price going to be $9.95? Was it going to be $10.75? How do you parse that last little bit? And getting everybody not to walk away from it over relatively small amounts of money is an art form. And, it dragged out for probably 9 months after we had the answer because we couldn't get everybody to agree.
It's interesting, but it sounds like there was also a relentless focus on sustainability to make sure that the supplier, in this case Cepheid, was going to continue to engage in the market because they actually could have a reasonable return.
Right. And this actually worked wonders for them on the stock price, which was really important because revenue growth at that point in their history was more important than profit growth. So they got a huge boost in sales. They placed a ton of instruments around the world that have helped them ever since. And once the automation kicked in, their cost recovery was great. And they went from almost a hand assembly to full robotics over the course of this deal.
So note to those that are listening is there are these unusual incentive structures. At the beginning of a company, they often care more about revenue growth than profit. But it does need to be sustainable and have a reasonable return in the medium term. Otherwise, they're just going to discontinue the business after a period of time.
Yeah. So that one was about, kind of the 101 of negotiation and then having some understanding of the market potential, because South Africa went from using about 180,000 tests to 1.8 million over a 12-month period. So just believing that that could be done, we had to be certain if we're representing a purchase order of, say, $50 million, which could be 5 million tests, we've got to believe that the uptake side of it's there. If you'll let me, I'd like to shift gears and talk about a very different type of a product, old technology, a product that had been sitting around for years, where the opportunity to do something big on it was there and it had never been taken advantage of. And it's one of the ones that I was personally most excited about. And this is a story about the company Bayer Pharmaceuticals and to some extent Merck. Bayer's product was called Jadel, and it's in a category called long-acting reversible contraception. So in the US, we're mostly familiar with contraceptive pills or other kind of short-term methods. Jadel and a similar product produced by Merck are little tiny silicone tubes filled with a hormone, and these tubes are placed under the skin in your forearm, and they elute very small concentrations of this hormone over a 5-year period. And so they provide continuous contraceptive coverage without any action needed on the part of the user. This particular product design came out of years of work on what were the needs of low-income women when it came to family planning in developing countries and also in the US. And that was a design that was preferred. So if you have one child and you want to space it by 2 or 3 years or whatever, long-acting methods that are reversible become the preference. So this product was actually first developed in the 70s and the 80s by the Population Council, a New York group funded by the Rockefeller Fund. This was probably one of the biggest deals that had ever been done in market shaping at the time, where the Gates Foundation and others risked over $300 million on a 6-year-long volume guarantee where quarterly orders had to be met over that entire period. And we committed to 40 million units of the product between Merck and Bayer at a time when the sales were around 2 million units a year. So we were predicting a very large increase in usage. Working on the demand side, our teams across 15 or 20, high-need countries were able to see and quantify an opportunity for a product that had less than 5% market share to go up to 15 or 20% market share of all contraception. Now, that opportunity had been there, forever, right? We didn't create that demand dynamics, but we saw the opportunity that the price of this product could come down roughly by about half. All of a sudden, it would be perceived as the cheapest method of family planning and not the most expensive. And that the underlying basics of wanting something that was not a short-term method were there. The fact that this product had been around for 10 or 15 years and only had less than 5% market share had convinced everybody, it's just, people don't want it. But our insight there in looking very carefully at the demand side and understanding the choice paradigm that women were going through, I think we saw an opportunity that others didn't. But how to get the price down by half was that mission impossible thing again. And let's talk a little bit about the negotiating environment in the global pharmaceutical and diagnostics industry. And you're going to go in and talk about price, right? What's the right price for this deal? How are we going to get it where we want to? Now, if you go into big pharma or big diagnostics to talk about price, you're going to get the lecture. And in the 2.5, 3 years that I had been at Chai, I had probably had the lecture about 25 times. They'll look at you sadly, you're not from around here. That's clear. Alan, let me explain to you. Pharmaceutical companies need substantial profits because innovation is risky and we have to fund the cost of 9 out of 10 of our clinical trials fail and 99 out of our 100 products fail. And so without these massive profits on the few that make it, there would be no innovation and all the drugs and diagnostics you benefit from today won't be there. So some version of that lecture you're going to get, particularly at a German-based company like Bayer. It wasn't going to be sweetness and light. It was going to be a hard sell. And so, you really wanted to do your homework. So I spent a lot of time understanding what was the R&D clinical program, who took the risk, and this is where you see that the Pop Council developed the product right through clinical trials off its own nickel. And then the only people they could find to license that product to was a small company in Finland called Laris. So I think in the early 80s, Laris started selling, Jadel under some different name in Finland and a few other markets. How did we get to Bayer? Well, okay, Laris was acquired by Schering in 96, and then Bayer acquired Schering in 2006. All this is going to take place about 8 or 10 years after that. So over the years, Bayer had built up sales of that product and Schering before it and some related products into $1 billion a year business. But I knew when I got there and they were about to start the lecture, well, time out, because that's not going to apply to Jadel, right? Somebody else paid for the R&D. You acquired a company that had acquired it. And all that's been happening from your perspective is about 10 years of profitable sales. So let's not do the lecture. Let's get real here. Now, when you look at this product and you hold it in your hand, you're going, this doesn't cost $500, right? That's what they were selling it for in the US. This might cost, $1.50. We had our chemistry team kind of look at the price of silicone. This is a generic hormone that's in there. And yes, you have to put the whole thing together, et cetera. So maybe it was $3.50 or $2.50. And they were selling it in the developing world for just under $20. And we needed a price, well below $10. In the US and Europe, they were selling it for anywhere from $300 to $800 and making very good money at it. So they were never going to concede that it only cost a couple of dollars to make. But they didn't throw us out when we said that we needed a price around, $8 or $9. So when I went out to Turku in Finland, the very same factory that Laris had been making that product in 83, now they had improved it. Although there was no automation around this product, there were a lot of Finnish people sitting in a sterile environment making tube by tube by tube. When they heard that we might start buying 3 or 4 or 5 million units a year instead of 1 million, or that we were representing people that would do that in the public health community, they asked the factory managers to come to a meeting with Chai with what are all the things that we could do jointly or that Chai could help us do that would make this product lower cost for us. And the list, frankly, was a lot of stuff that we had not expected. They said, right now, we get very small orders that are completely irregular. We have different package inserts for 25 different countries. We have different pack sizes. We have 120 SKUs for this one product. Alan, if you want to do a deal with us, we're going to have one SKU. We're going to have the public health pack. It's going to have 50 units in it. It's going to have one 3-language package insert in it, same one. And we don't hold inventory around here. So anything we make is got to be picked up off the loading dock at the end of the month. You guys can put it in the warehouse if you want, but we're not going to pay for that. So we had a bunch of really nitty-gritty stuff that, frankly, at Chai we loved. And we're going, oh, okay. So you're saying we do all this stuff. both sides will feel that we've really taken costs out of the system. They said, yep. And also, if you guys, if this long-term order is firm, fixed price and not going to change, we will also roll that into an investment proposal that we can put to our management to automate production. Because at the volumes you're talking about, it would make sense, particularly if we know we've got a long runway. So talking about it now, it kind of, some of those things probably sound obvious. It'll reduce the number of SKUs, regularize ordering. You have an annual rolling forecast where each quarter you know what you're going to sell. But getting that to happen in a global market with 75 different countries buying through different mechanisms was a huge amount of work that Chai undertook. And so our market shaping, our secret sauce in this case, wasn't really, the COGS piece of it so much. Yes, we knew we could get that price. It would be economically feasible. But it was our ability to coordinate and work with the demand side to say, hey, guys, does it really matter if you get a box of 50 instead of boxes of 10? Package insert, all of that meant regulatory approval changes at the country level. So there's a lot of complexity. But I think we built momentum for the deal by getting really positive responses from the family planning teams in these countries. And the impact was nothing short of epic. So this is why you get excited about access programs or market shaping. Over the course of the deal, this product went from being about 1 to 2% of the method mix, if you will, to in the 15 to 20% range, depending on which country. But amazingly, the growth in contraceptive coverage over that 6-7 year period, 75% of the increase in contraceptive coverage came from the long-acting methods that hadn't been used. And so, hundreds of thousands of lives were saved in pregnancies that were averted and women dying in childbirth. Bringing that price down by half, coupled with the demand side work on education, on building awareness, et cetera, just had a phenomenal impact. And the heroes of the story continue to be, at Bayer and elsewhere rather than at Chai. I mean, these guys said, okay, if you do your 8 things, we'll do our thing. And I visited the factory a couple of years later. Unbelievable custom-made robots picking up these little pieces of silicone, inserting this and checking everything, all the packaging. The whole thing had been automated, and 30 people who had been doing hand assembly had been redeployed, throughout the factory. So they were over the moon. It was now a showpiece. And I think most importantly, from their perspective, Bayer is a big place. It's a chemical company. It's a pharma company. Having something to motivate their employees about they're actually having an impact on public health in low-income countries proved to be hugely important. Their anonymous comment box, the head of the program, over the years we were friends, said to me, the CEO personally told me how more employees had mentioned the Janelle Access program than anything else that Bayer had been done. Even though, the money side of it was just completely trivial. But this reaching out to provide family planning products to the developing world, really resonated with the staff and was a great thing for the company to be able to show its employees that they really cared about some of these issues.
That's a great story. Super illustrative of the tactics and techniques, both on the demand side and the supply side, to accelerate market development. Prices came down, volumes went up. The public health community was elated, as was the supplier. This is going to sound like when we worked together, Alan, but I'm curious, was it truly cost plus? Because it sounds like they were still at that $8-9 level, making massive margins on a per unit basis. Like the unit economics were really attractive. And after they've invested in automation and after Chai and countries have harmonized requirements to reduce from whatever it was, 120 SKUs to 1.
Well, this really wasn't a cost plus deal. This was one that the pricing target we had set was driven by the cost of a couple year of protection. So if you go out and buy condoms, you need 1 a day or 1 for every time you have sex, multiply by how many you need for a year. That should cost, for a year. Contraceptive pills, maybe they're $30 a month, $300 a year. So in the global market, we were doing our calculations and we needed the Janelle product to be on a couple years of protection, about 15 to 20% below the lowest cost method. And that's where the $850 price came from. But Merck had turned us down flat, right?
Yep.
It would not go, said impossible, we're not going below $10. They eventually did after we signed the deal with Bayer. But we only had, one choice at that point. So we could only push so far to get the thing started.
Alan, can you describe the scene where Merck said it's impossible to do this deal?
Yeah. First of all, the dynamics between Merck and Bayer were very different. We sort of started out with Merck, and I think Ira started out with Merck. He had some relationships, and I remember going to a meeting with him, and the Merck campus in New Jersey, without exaggeration, it's probably a mile of parkland from the main gate where you do the security check till you get to the building. And we're going, yeah, we're going to go in here and talk about overheads. And the meeting had 15 or 20 people in it. Merck comes across as the classic big pharma, lots of formality, lots of layers upon layers upon layers. Nobody ever speaks their mind. This had been positioned as kind of a CSR thing. Hey, it's President Clinton. We got to do something nice here. And people were being told to sort of play along. I don't think any of the people in the room really knew much about the actual business of selling that product.
Interesting.
It was not a big money earner. This was not an important product. And then finally, when he insisted that the price be below $10, we got kind of a pat on the back and said, oh, no, that's silly. We're not going to do that. And it was a blow to the Chai team in the program because there are really only two choices. And we thought we were much further along in relationship building, understanding what was necessary, how the program would work, what the forecast would be, et cetera. And so we were scrambling at that point.
I remember those kinds of meetings, and they'd bring like 18 vice presidents in. And It's funny, the signal that is being sent from them is we care about you. But the real signal when you're doing deals is there's no one decision maker. And if there's no one decision maker, nothing will happen. That sounds like what you had with Merck, where you had many, many people in the room. I can only imagine how frustrated Ira was after spending so much time with them. What did he say? Like, was there a blow up moment or what happened?
I do remember that later on, after the Bayer deal was in the bag, Merck reached out with a new person and, kind of starts out right, says, well, I'm the president for women's health, been in the role here. And, I really, we're interested in this thing when we get back and have a meeting. And I said, we absolutely can meet you for dinner, but I think we should be prepared to talk business. I don't think, it should be a big meeting. It'll just be Ira and I. And I think it should just be, you and X, because restaurants can be noisy. We're not going to be able to talk. I think it needs to be a small group. So I think he pretty much showed up on his own, but he was a smarter character, right? And we can date this because this was the day of or the day after when Hillary had been campaigning for the presidency and had fainted or something like that, but went to the hospital.
Yeah.
And I'm already there. Ira's late, of course, right? So we're sitting, trying to make small talk and whatever. This is like the lowest person this guy has ever had to spend, 7:30 at night with. So Ira comes in and he goes, well, how are you? So pleased to meet you, being very nice. How's everything? And Ira goes, well, I think she's going to be fine. And it takes him a while to realize who that she was. And that's where Ira operated. But it was a great line that, he was just off, dealing with potentially the next president of the United States and the previous one. This guy, very graciously, without any bile about what had happened, and said, there had been mistakes made and there had been changes made in the organization. And they pretty much at that meeting agreed to, because we had already struck a deal, right, with Bayer. So there was the volume guarantee of 40 million units. We were going to split it up 20 million. But given where Bayer went on this, 27 million units got allocated to Bayer over the 6-year time frame and 13 million to Merck. So Merck ended up cutting their price anyway because they had to match Bayer, otherwise they're going to lose market share for a deal that effectively was less than their current market share that was out there, which was way the opposite for Bayer, which was going to be a doubling of sales over the period. And we don't want to be rude to Merck or anything, but it was not, from a business point of view, a smart deal at all. But there were only two suppliers, Merck and Bayer. We were aware of the fact that there was still money on the table. And our solution there was we needed a third supplier, and that takes time. And so that did happen. And a third supplier out of China eventually came in the market. I would say it took us another 5 to 7 years to get that to happen and put some pricing pressure on the duopoly. And prices have now come down probably another 15 or 20%. They're probably in the $650 range. But both of these deals have had staying power. Both of these product categories are huge today, and pricing has come down below where we negotiated it.
So, and this is really important. I think for anyone listening, the market leaders often have very little incentive. When they have a reasonable sized business, they're already the market leader. They're saying, why would we do anything? Why would we change or take risk on anything? Let's just keep it going. Even the second place supplier in a market has little reason. It's often the third place the hungry supplier or the new entrant that you need to work with in order to get some sort of deal done that then spurs the other two to start working because they're threatened by competition. And at any large enough marketplace, if you have three, you can probably get one to work with you, and or that will continue to create competition amongst the suppliers. So price will come down, quality will be maintained, product enhancements will be made because three breaks a duopoly or monopoly.
Yeah.
And so I think this idea of work with the hungry supplier, work with the new entrant, and you always want to have three at every single level of the supply chain to promote competition, price reduction, and progress is a really important consideration in the world of market shaping. Would you agree? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely would agree with that. It makes the most difference to have three. 4 and 5 probably helps you a little bit, but 3 seems to be the magic thing. A good example of the kind of problem you were just mentioning has to do with treatment drugs for HIV. This is a massive market outside of the Western markets because most people who are still dealing with HIV, it's about 90% of the people are outside the US and Western Europe. And this was a product area that Chai had worked on, right from day one, right? How could we get treatment drugs that were available in the West to be available in low-income countries? At the same time, you've got the drug industry innovating and bringing out new products. In the time period we're talking about here, kind of post-2015 period, several breakthrough drugs had been introduced in Western markets called integrase inhibitors. And they had two really important characteristics from the point of view of the patient. Number one is they didn't have side effects. And then secondly, really, really important, the virus did not find a way to mutate around integrase inhibitors in the way it had around some of the earlier drugs. So in the West, I think in 2013, 14, 15-ish, a number of companies had introduced integrase inhibitors, and they were the standard of care in the West. And we were kind of scratching our heads saying, oh boy, how can we get this product into the developing world markets and get the benefits on a much greater scale? So the challenge here, how do volume guarantees help a company bridge that part where we're saying to get market growth, I need price X, $1. And you're saying, yeah, but my costs at low volumes are $2. So that's not going to work for me. But if I guarantee you sales over, say, a 5-year period, 20 million units, and your costs go from $2 to 50 cents over that time, you're going to lose a little money in the early period, but you'll make it back by building the market later on, and you'll get your volumes up. And those are permanent improvements in your cost structure. And this was the story of how we ended up getting dolutegravir, the GSK product, into the market in developing countries. GSK had a license to a bunch of companies in India, but here was the rub. We had to tell the Indian companies who had sales of, cumulatively together, 20 million people were taking the drug, so they had large volumes of sales, that we need you to introduce a new and better product, but at a lower price than the current standard of care. Because we had learned through close consultation with governments, you have a fixed pool of money in your public health system. So if I'm treating 5,000 patients for $100 each, if that cost goes up to 120, I'm only going to be able to treat 4,000 patients or whatever the math is. So the fact that it's innovative and you get a better outcome is not going to be compelling in the public health world. Carolyn Amol, who heads our HIV group, and I had kind of made a rule of thumb. We had said, hey, to bring something new into the market, even if it's better, it's got to be 15% cheaper because there's a transition cost, there's a training cost, and so 15% sort of compensates you for that. So we're going to have to make this pitch to the generic companies that we want you to introduce a 3-drug combination product with dolutegravir for 15% less than what you're selling your current product for, and convince them that this is going to be economically viable. So those of us who have worked with generic companies understand that the bulk of the cost structure for most small molecule drugs that are sold in pill form is really based on milligrams. It's chemistry. And so it's like making blue jeans or widgets of any kind. The more you make, or the more materials that go in, the more expensive they get. But as you make lots and lots of them, the price goes down. So if I'm going to make something that only needs 50 milligrams of raw materials and replace something that took 600 milligrams, in theory, if I get the volumes up, it's going to be much, much cheaper. And so that was our pitch through a lot of formulas arguing about, what's the cost savings, and very, very careful planning what the batch sizes would be and allowing companies to plan ahead through this volume guarantee mechanism. We convinced them to launch a brand new product, with an integrase inhibitor in it at literally 15% below what the current product was selling for. Now, let's see what the impact was. Let's cut to the chase. So Gates and others, but mostly Gates, put up close to 500 million in guarantees. It was the largest deal, I think, at the time that they had ever done.
Wow.
This is a fixed price binding commitment that in each annual period, X number of units will be sold. If they're not sold in the market, the backers of the volume guarantee, the Gates Foundation or others, will have to buy the product. It's a firm take-or-pay agreement. So with those in place over 2 or 3 years, the companies were willing to make the switch. And typically, a new product rollout can take a very long time. But the excitement around this product and the price cut together meant that over a period of 18 months, close to 15 million people switched from regimen A to regimen B. And visiting these factories and seeing the pills coming out and realizing how this is how lives get saved. When you're there and you see the care and skill that goes into producing a triple combination product in pill form that you take once a day to prevent you from getting AIDS. You may be HIV positive, but the viral load is not measurable. It's amazing. And they're producing billions of these pills as we speak. The current cost of that same drug is 10 cents a day. So we're down to $36 a year, which is amazing. And the companies are making money at that level and producing billions of pills. So, for market shaping, again, this was a deal that you couldn't even walk in the door with unless you had spent years working with these companies and were a trusted intermediary. Chai and I benefited from having a very strong team in India who knew these people and had worked with senior management and R&D management over 15 years before we sat down on what seemed a very audacious proposal. Scrap your current business, go for something new, but charge a lot less for it. Without the credibility, we wouldn't have even gotten to first base. Then without that technical know-how and confidence to sit side by side with the manufacturing team and let everybody work through the numbers to see if it's possible or not. And what they saw is that they would have to make year advance purchase commitments for raw materials and lock in prices. But by having the demand side guaranteed, those were risks they were willing to take. I think the lesson on the deal had a lot to do with relationships built up over years. Too many folks that want to do market shaping and maybe aren't from the private sector or don't know that much about companies, aren't that comfortable with business, maybe don't appreciate that you can't just call somebody up and say, hey, I want to talk about the price of your product. This is something that evolves over years of talking to them about the market opportunities, strategies. We made twice a year meetings and we would visit all the companies with market forecasts, technical ideas, new product suggestions, just to kind of meet and greet, sharing collaborative information about where are the markets going, where's the technology going, a free service that we provide and share all our market forecasts. But you're giving something to folks who are commercially oriented that is valuable to them. And so there's a willingness to talk about how we can both have more impact. But it's not done from the ivory tower. You've got to be out working with companies to see these opportunities.
What a hugely inspiring story, Alan. And it illustrates just like the power of what can be achieved when you are that trusted intermediary and doing that shuttle diplomacy between the demand and the supply sides of the market. If you could wave a wand and apply this concept of market shaping to a new product category, whether it's in healthcare or not, I'm curious, where would you wave that wand and be like, there needs to be work done in this area and market shaping can make a huge impact?
A project that I worked on just before I left Chai got us into a completely different area, but we did see an opportunity, and this was with heat pumps. So this was on energy efficiency, and we found again that building relationships, understanding not just the manufacturing costs, but in the case of a heat pump, what happens to that heat pump before it actually gets into somebody's house, and that most of the markup really happens in the post-manufacturing stage because the parts are all pretty standardized and made in high volumes and hard to cost reduce those. So climate change, energy efficiency, products in that area, people have been looking long and hard to see what the market shaping opportunities are. Is there a case here where you can move a company from high cost, low volume to lower cost, high volume? Is that significant enough to really, move the dial on impact? And the one thing that I believe quite strongly where people should look, the government spends a ton of money on a ton of stuff. The US government, I'm talking about now, very little effort is ever made to kind of leverage that spend. And people underestimate the value of guaranteed contracts, right? If they've never been on the sales side of running a company, you would gladly trade some of your capacity and lock it in 2 years from now for a 30, 40% discount. And you'll see this over and over again, that marginal new business that you're bringing to the table that they couldn't get, but at a completely different price point is a lot more likely opportunity than most people think. So obviously selling price very high versus COGS is a good thing, but that's not the only thing that you have to look for. It's could standardization and assured demand take costs out of the system? Just do the mechanics.
If you were giving one piece of advice to younger professionals getting involved in this area, what's the one piece of advice you would give them?
You got to believe. If you don't believe, don't do it.
That's awesome. Alan, it's been such a great pleasure to talk to you again. What you guys have done in the last decade plus since we worked together is truly amazing. And yet it's still grounded in the same core principles, which is so cool to see.
Yep.
Thanks, Alan, for joining us today.
Thanks, Inder.
Thanks for listening to the Market Shapers podcast. I'm Inder Singh. If you enjoyed the show, please like it or leave us a review and subscribe in your favorite app so you don't miss the next episode. Market Shapers is produced by me with help from University FM. Special thanks to Renaissance Philanthropy, Griffin Catalyst, and the Digital Harbor Foundation for their support.